While Russia's campaign in Syria, which was waged mainly through air power and military advisors who left the actual land combat to the Syrian forces and their allies, the next such campaign, which might occur either in the Middle East, someplace closer to Russian borders, or even on Russian territory itself, could very well require a sizable ground operation. While the Russian ground forces were not directly tested in Syria, even though its command and advisory personnel proved to be far more capable than the indigenous military talent left over from Saddam Hussein's military and advisors proved by Turkey and Gulf Arab states. In the event that the Russian ground forces find themselves having to fight a land war, they will be as well prepared as their aerial counterparts. While the ground forces languished for most of the first decade of the century, when there were no major military threats to Russia in evidence, the gradual deterioration of relations which followed the 2008 financial crisis, the subsequent systemic economic crisis, and the crisis-induced need to conquer new markets to avert economic collapse in the West, meant that the neglect had to be quickly reversed. The reversal, which is still underway, includes not only a far more active training agenda with numerous readiness alert drills and large-scale multi-service strategic exercises which are once again eclipsing NATO's ability to stage large operations, is also complemented by the development of state-of-the-art training methods. The 333rd Combat Training Center, CTC, in Molino, exemplifies the ground forces' emphasis on combat readiness. Even though Russian equipment tends to be durable and easily serviced, high-intensity training does put considerable wear and tear on it and requires a considerable expenditure of fuel. Moreover, such training also tends to damage equipment when used by inexperienced operators. To maximize the training regimen's effectiveness, the Russian military is turning to simulator training not only for individual training but also for large unit training. The 333rd CTC allows a complete motorized rifle brigade of several thousand troops to undergo a 7-week training program, which starts with individual soldier assessment, followed by company and battalion exercises, and finishing with a brigade exercise. The center allows the soldiers and units to begin with simulator exercises to acquire the basic individual and unit skills, to be followed with full-scale field exercises with the use of laser simulators and live fire by all types of weapons available to a motorized rifle brigade. The 333rd CTC also includes a battle town that can be used to practice urban warfare skills by a single battalion task force at a time. The center began its operations in September 2015, with the first unit to undergo training being a Navy infantry brigade. It is probably not a coincidence that the first Russian troops to be deployed to Syria were naval infantrymen who underwent advanced combat training at the 333rd. The ground forces plan to send 3 complete brigades through the center every year, though in theory the center could accommodate 6 complete 7-week training cycles a year, and there is also an intense and accelerated version of the training program available, which is likely to be used when a combat operation is imminent. On a final note, the 333rd Center contractors included the German firm Rheinmetall, which withdrew from the project following the EU's imposition of sanctions on Russia in 2014. However, in a display of import substitution, the Russian defense industry proved capable of meeting the challenge and completing the center using domestic technologies. The planned expansion of the ground forces, which will include the reactivation of 4 motorized rifle and tank divisions, means that the demands on the training facilities will only increase. The 333rd CTC exists mainly to serve the needs of the Western Military District. In the future, each of the remaining 3 military districts are expected to receive a similar training facility.
On March 14th, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the partial withdrawal of the Russian military from Syria, starting from March the 15th. The Russian support for the Syrian government reversed the militants' momentum. Now, the pro-government forces have the advantage. Nonetheless, the militants haven't been defeated. They are still able to counter-attack and repel the government troops' advances using a mobile defense. Considering this, a significant drawdown of Russian forces could weaken the Syrian government's efforts on the ground. However, it is important to remember that the Russian military facilities and limited military contingent, including an advisory mission, are staying in Syria. Supplies of arms and military equipment have been continuing. Moreover, Iranian support for the Syrian government and Hezbollah involvement in the conflict cannot be ignored. With its actions in Syria, Russia has demonstrated its improved military capabilities and some new weapons which will contribute to arms sales for sure. Russia has also achieved its goal of weakening ISIS, including the impulse which the Russian invasion gave to the US-led coalition and to the Kurdish units. Washington hasn't been able to continue a low-intensity campaign or ignore ISIS targets amid the Kremlin actions. Even if ISIS isn't entirely defeated, the terrorists in Syria and Iraq are much weaker than they were 5 months ago. The main sources of their funding have been publicly revealed and damaged. The stability of the allied Syrian government has also been ensured with pinpoint efforts. According to the information received by South Front from a source close to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russia, in international relations, is continuing to show a fundamentally different approach to that of the US and the West. The decision on the partial withdrawal of its military from Syria is a move that clearly shows the commitment of the Russian leadership to a sequence of actions aimed at a comprehensive settlement of the crisis by peaceful means. Russia is not looking for an opportunity to gain a colonial resource-rich territory or to create puppet regimes, but only to provide necessary and sufficient assistance in the fight against terrorism and extremism, while seeking to avoid escalation of the conflict and to minimize civilian casualties.
When asked about Russian operations in Syria, most people would immediately mention the Russian fighter bombers, attack aircraft, combat helicopters, and cruise missile volleys. Few would mention the quiet work behind the scenes that was performed by a large group of highly dedicated professionals who helped transform the Syrian military that was on the brink of defeat into a force that could once again begin liberating Syria's territory. Without denying the importance of the air campaign, the airstrikes alone would not have been enough to turn the tide of war. When the Russian military began its intervention in Syria, the situation at the front demanded a rapid provision of specialized military support in order to offset the jihadists' numerical superiority by superior firepower. That was quickly provided by supplying the Syrian Arab army with T-90 tanks and TOS-1A self-propelled thermobarbaric rocket launchers, which are highly effective at reducing fortifications. However, in order to allow the Syrian army to resume the offensive, both its equipment and personnel would have to be replenished and retrained. Unfortunately, the Syrian military was in a state of serious neglect when the rebellion broke out, and large-scale combat operations quickly revealed this sad state of affairs. Much of its equipment was sidelined for lack of maintenance. Units were under-strengthened and short of specialist personnel. At the time, the Syrian soldiers were poorly trained, even ones assigned to crew sophisticated weapon systems like tanks and self-propelled artillery weapons. Equipment maintenance systems were sufficient to cope with peacetime demands, but quickly broke down as soon as the Syrian military attempted large-scale operations. The Syrian military's large pool of equipment also created an attitude of neglect towards maintenance and evacuation of damaged machines. To help, the Russian Ministry of Defense utilized the Syrian Express supply route to send a large number of T-72B tanks, BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles, and rocket artillery weapons to Syria. Russian advisors then got to work training Syrian troops both on the use of the new vehicles and operating them as part of a tactical combat team. Even more equipment found its way into the Syrian units thanks to Russian specialists restoring Syria's armored vehicle repair shops, which quickly returned hundreds of broken down or long-term stored armored vehicles to service. Syria's Air Force returned to the skies thanks to Russian specialists and timely delivery of spare parts. The Russian advisors also established training courses for the specialist personnel, without which no military can effectively conduct large-scale operations. These specialists included logistics experts, communications experts, and equally important, operational planners. This work is, of course, not without danger, given the terrorists' ability to strike in almost any part of Syria. One Russian advisor was killed in Latakia province in unknown circumstances. The Russian advisors also serve as de facto diplomats, whose presence is necessary to ensure the capability of pro-government forces, which include recently recruited tribal and regional militias, and even former opposition forces working smoothly together. For example, it is difficult to imagine the Kurds and the Syrian military operating effectively without Russian intermediation. For all these efforts, the situation in Syria still remains critical. Syrian forces' problems have not been fully resolved, and ISIS and other jihadist forces are still capable of launching local counterattacks, as they recently did at Kanasa. Because government forces are not large enough to properly defend the lengthy front lines against all the rebel factions. However, the trend is in a positive direction. The January fighting in Salma was a demonstration of the Russian efforts to train complete battalion task force of the Syrian army to conduct offensive operations. It was the first operation carried out by one of the new Russian-trained battalions. Since the training program was launched in October 2015, it would appear that the training cycle lasts 3 months before the unit is sent into the front lines, and more such units have been joining the fray recently and turning the tide of the war. The opposition's newly discovered willingness to negotiate is entirely due to their belated recognition that the balance of forces has been shifting against them.